Chapter 15. If Tommy was honest with himself, he really shouldn't spend most of his therapy sessions with Puffy just talking shit about Linda Smith. Puffy never tried to change the subject, or direct it to something else, like maybe the massive number of issues and underlying trauma he had picked up from centuries of death and torment from Dream. But, as always, Tommy preferred to ignore that and talk about something else. Nonetheless, he did get some heat off his chest, with slagging off Linda for a solid hour. Puffy had to calm him down when he got a bit too into describing what he would do to Linda in a lawless world. Apparently, wanting to curb stomp an elderly woman who was there to help foster children was an immoral thing to say. Puffy seemed to want to fight the woman as well, though. The agreement he had with Wilbur was what he liked most out of these therapy sessions. This time, they sat on a picnic bench in the local park, snacking on the meal deals they bought from the Tesco Express. Wilbur still came out of his session crying, but it wasn't as bad as the last. A triple chicken sandwich distracted Wilbur well enough. "What do you talk about with your therapist to get you all crying and shit?" Tommy asked, as he took another bite from his sandwich. "Stop talking with your mouth full, you disgusting child," Wilbur scolded. And we talked about my mum." Tommy sipped on his drink as Wilbur fiddled with his hands, something he regularly did. "I told him about the song I made about her, and the idea I had to turn it into something else," he explained, peering past Tommy's head, almost as if he wasn't able to look Tommy in the eyes. "Your mother was right. Yeah, that one. I might just base it on a past breakup I had during year 12. Wilbur said, looking back down at his hands. "Her sister hated me during that relationship." Tommy threw his Mars bar at Wilbur, catching his attention. He didn't like the anxiety rummaging in Wilbur's head. "Were you a dickhead or something?" Wilbur chuckled humorlessly. "Yep. Some general advice for you? Don't go into a relationship with someone after a family death. It's not a good idea." "Her sister was right to hate you then," Tommy joked, hoping that if he treated this entire thing like a piss take, then Wilbur would do the same. It was usually how he got out of dealing with sadness. "Thanks for the new song title. Credit me, you prick." Brown eyes stared back at him, glinted with hilarity. "Nope. You are the worst person I have ever met. The worst person you have ever met literally bought you your food," Wilbur quipped back, his shoulders more relaxed than before. "Don't gloat over buying me a £3 meal deal, that's just sad." There was a sudden pause before the two burst out laughing. Warmth radiated in his chest, melting the spring chill on his skin as Wilbur beamed at him, all anxiety forgotten about. He liked it better this way. "Well, with your album," Tommy began, his voice softer than usual, "would you ever sing them to me? If this goes well, I'll sing them to everyone. You and Technoblade first," Wilbur said with a timid smile. "Why Techno?" "I crave his validation." "From the Blade?" Tommy asked, his scowl creasing as Wilbur nodded. "You are a sad, sad man." "You keep calling me sad today." Tommy pointed to the opened tissue packet on the table, and Wilbur whacked his hand away. "What about singing them to Phil?" he asked. Wilbur put down his sandwich. "He'll be the hardest to do them to." "Well, I'll have you know, I am the harshest song critic that you will ever meet, so it should be worse to perform it to me," Tommy replied, grinning. The man rolled his eyes half-heartedly. "If you're there as well, I'll sing them to Dad later on." "I'll be there," Tommy said, his throat strained as he willed himself to forget that if Wilbur didn't perform before the 9th of April, he wouldn't be here at all. Wilbur's lips formed into a smile, his eyes lingering on Tommy before he continued eating his sandwich. Tommy's phone vibrated on the picnic table. He grimaced and hesitated before replying. Nikki. I need to talk to you, if that's all right. Tommy. I'm in the park with Wilbur. You can join us if you want. He put his phone back on the bench, no longer hungry. Who was that? Wilbur asked. Nikki. She needs to talk to me. What about? Tommy froze. Maths. Maths? Wilbur repeated, skeptical. Yep. Mathematics, Pythagoras, equilateral triangles and all that. Tommy rambled, avoiding eye contact. You're so shit at lying. Wilbur scoffed. I'll leave you two alone when she comes. Good, I don't think you'd want to be here when we go on our rants about how much we dislike Wilbur Kraft. You are the reason I need therapy. No, I'm the reason you're getting therapy. Wilbur ruffled his hair harshly from across the table. Disrespect me again, I dare you. You are a bitch, Tommy exclaimed as he tried to fight against Wilbur's hold on him. The two continued to attack each other across the picnic table until a feminine voice interjected from behind them. Am I interrupting something? Oh, hey, Nikki. You can join me in beating the shit out of Tommy if you want, Wilbur said nonchalantly as he strangled the boy. This is child abuse. Nikki pulled Wilbur's ear until he let go of Tommy. Nikki, what the fuck? You traitor. I came here to talk to Tommy, not to watch him die, Nikki said as she sat beside Wilbur. Her hair was styled differently today. The pink dye had faded and appeared blonder. She was still in her sixth form clothes from school earlier. Anyway, Nikki, do you want the rest of my crisps before I go? So you give them to her and not me? Yes. Tommy gaped at him. No, thank you, Will, Nikki replied, a small smile on her lips as Tommy glared at Wilbur. Wilbur stood up and threw the crisp packet in the bin, saluting at an annoyed Tommy as he walked away. Now that it was just Tommy and Nikki, the boy grew nervous. He had an idea of what Nikki wanted to talk about, since there was only one thing it could be. But he wanted to discuss this with Puffy before he decided if he should forgive Nikki or not. Ever since he realized she was Nihachu, the physical similarities between the two were obvious, yet the slight differences threw him off. The Nihachu he knew was 19, with her youth disrupted by the commotion of warfare and responsibility, and eyes darker, burdened by lives she had slain during the conflict. This Nihachu, this Nikki, was younger, more relaxed. There were no scars across her face, no slit in her eyebrow, and no bloodshed staining her skin. She was free, and that was all Tommy hoped to achieve. How are you? He asked after the silence, not quite sure how to start this conversation, or if he should wait for her to say something first. I'm fine, Nikki said. She exhaled sharply. I want to explain myself, or just tell you what I think about all this with our past, if you'll let me. He nodded, and Nikki sighed again, preparing herself. When I joined the revolution, I always admired you, even if you annoyed me sometimes with how impulsive you were in battle. That carefree part of you was so intoxicating. You made me feel lighter, younger, whilst we were on the brink of another war. Though, after your brother died, that intoxication I felt died along with him. Nikki fiddled with her necklace as she spoke. I blamed you for everything. For causing the wars, for instigating more conflict, for your brother dying. But even after your exile, the conflict still happened. It wasn't your doing. Tommy pulled his coat around him, hating the self-deprecation plastered on Nikki's face and guilt riddling in her eyes. But I did cause more conflict. We both wronged each other. Nikki interrupted, taking his hand. But my wronging of you resulted in your death. So let me apologize, okay? He looked down at Nikki's hands. Her nails were painted a pastel blue. He remembered how she and Fundy used to gather materials so she could do nail art during the calmer periods before the major wars. They used beeswax, egg whites, and dyes from flowers. The result was never pretty, but she loved it. They all loved it. He preferred those times, before any of them had taken a life, and could never look at an innocent kingdom civilian the same way. You're right, that I did abandon you in exile. I stood by as you were sent away, and I regretted that decision every single day until I died on that battlefield. I had failed someone I saw, and still see, as a younger brother. Tommy flinched, and she held his hands tighter. I failed you, Tommy, and I am so sorry for that. A part of him just wanted to say that it was okay. Reassure Nikki that it was all in the past and didn't matter anymore. But he didn't want to lie to himself about this. Even though it was in the past, every single void visit reminded him of his relentless suffering in exile, where a man he thought was his friend, instead of his captor and abuser, never left him alone. Never let a day pass without another scar, whether physical or mental, haunting him. It wasn't okay, and it couldn't be until he healed from it. Yet that would take years he didn't have. Nikki squeezed his hand softly, snapping him out of his thoughts. Her blue eyes glistened with tears, and her eyebrows furrowed. She was waiting for his response, but he didn't have one. You don't have to forgive me, Tommy, Nikki whispered over the cold wind. He bit on his cheek and fiddled with the rings on Nikki's fingers. He focused on Clementine's advice. To recover from this, he needed to know more about the aftermath. What was it like after I died? He asked, his voice hesitant. He hadn't read this part in his history textbook. He didn't want to learn about that from an inaccurate and biased point of view that butchered Nikki's history as well. He figured out that Nick Chu was Nikki. No wonder she hated that class. It was peaceful for a while. Quieter, Nikki said, her honest words lodging a sword through his heart. But loveless. The one person who still had joy for the revolution, optimism for freedom, and the compassion to endure as many wars as the world threw at them, had gone. A tear fell down her cheeks. Tobias then failed to secure peace, and we knew what we had to do. We had to kill George, but even our president wasn't keen on that idea. Either way, our revolution ended with bloodshed, with mine, Fundy, and George's deaths, and Tobias fled to establish Snowchester. Tommy didn't understand how she could say such news, such events, with a soft tone, no bitterness or spite present. But it seemed she used her centuries in the void to accept this. Though he was glad he wasn't there to see the tragic fate of the revolution his brother founded, to see his former best friend abandon his people and fellow soldiers die to a losing battle. What was my brother like in the void? He asked, his eyes lingering on the necklace around Nikki's neck, the one his brother crafted. Nikki fidgeted in her seat. He was different. After every rebirth, he came back more broken than before. He asked me to stand at the gates every day he wasn't there in case you showed up. He may not have shown that he loved you during his last moments alive, but he did. He did love you. Tommy believed her words, or at least wanted to believe they were true. He savored the times where his brother wasn't destroyed by Eric's betrayal, corrupting the fight for freedom into a quest for power and control. He missed the man who always drew small circles into Tommy's shoulder with his thumb whenever they hugged. The man who gazed at Tommy as if he was the only shining star in the empty sky. He loved the man his brother used to be. He wasn't sure about the man he died as. Nikki unclasped her necklace and placed it in Tommy's hands, a sad smile hindering the kindness in her eyes. Take it. He'd want you to have it. He touched the stone tied to a frail rope and sighed. He was there when his brother crafted them. Each necklace had a different colored stone, with Nikki's one being white. He fiddled with the necklace before putting it on. The weight felt natural around his neck. Thank you, he mumbled, and cleared his throat, wanting to change the subject from his brother. Anyway, what's your myth in this life, then? Nikki blinked at the conversation change, her eyes still glued to the necklace. You better not have been Oedipus. Nikki frowned. No, you are not a motherfucker. She rolled her eyes and shook her head. No, I wasn't the incest guy. I was Daphne, the nymph who was shot with a hatred arrow for Apollo, whilst he lusted over her because of Eris's arrow. Oh, that must not have ended well for you, Tommy said, grimacing. Having a myth that resulted in an obsessive man stalking you, despite being rejected multiple times, was not fun. She muttered. It's why I moved from Germany to here. Does Tubbo know about the curse? No. He knows about the tattoo, but he thinks it's related to some German mafia. Tommy paused, then remembered the weird conversation he had with Tubbo when he went around his house. Is that why Tubbo thinks I don't like Germany? If he saw your tattoo, then yes. Well, that explains it, he said. A silence followed, and Tommy huffed. He didn't know where to go from here. Nikki expected a response from him. I don't think I can forgive you yet. But I'm fine with you, if that makes sense, he eventually said. His throat closed up. Nikki nodded. I'm sorry as well. I did abandon you too, especially after he died. You were grieving. You shouldn't have needed to comfort me during that, she said, sorrow on her face. Stop trying to defend me. I fucked up. I've had many years in that void with the other people who wronged me too. I've healed from it, she reassured. That's what I need to do now. Tommy didn't know how he was going to get over it, get past exile, and recover from the wounds that were centuries deep. But he'd try. Dream, deciding to give him a visit as soon as he fell asleep when he got home, fucked with Tommy's path of recovery, though. He was back on the beach that the boat took him to before. Well, it looked more like an island now. Dream stood there, waiting for him, an empty table by his side. Tommy walked over, the wind violating his exposed skin. We're not playing that board game again, are we? No, we're not playing the Gnosis game, Dream answered. I need to show you something. Dream reached forward and gripped Tommy's arm harshly, and before he knew it, the void swallowed him whole. His eyes flew open, dazed and distressed, as he regained consciousness. Dream no longer stood by his side. He was alone in a dark apartment. The walls had wood paneling. Bowl lights hung from the ceiling. A dark green sofa with orange pillows sat in front of an old television. There were framed pictures on the walls of a mother with a baby in her arms and two younger children by her side. The mother had bruises under her eyes from lack of sleep, but the smile adorned on her lips as she gazed down at the baby cuddled to her chest brightened her entire face. Tommy pulled back the striped curtains. He was in a city apartment, probably during the 1950s or 1960s. He walked into the closest room, and 2 children lay in their beds, with their mother asleep on the chair beside them. The mother's hand perched on the side of the bed. She was probably holding her son's hand before the exhaustion took over. Shelves were nailed above their beds. One had dinosaur figures placed on them, and the other had old play dolls. A comfortable feeling rumbled in his chest as he stared at the family. The love between them was obvious, but it confused him. Why did Dream bring him here? To rub it in that this was what a loving and stable family looked like? Something Tommy never grew up with? He didn't know. He went back into the living room, and a startled noise came from around the corner. It came from a pink crib which had a baby girl inside. He stepped closer, and the baby started to cry. Hey, no, it's okay. Tommy picked her up and held the baby, rubbing her back to calm her down. He continued whispering, You're all right, you're fine. Tommy cradled her head with his hands, trying to be as gentle as possible, and rocked her until the cries slowly stopped. He smiled down at the baby, its wide and innocent eyes staring back at him. A toothless grin came across her face as he tickled under her chin. Hello, little one, he said, softly, still smiling. What's your name? With his other hand, he carefully pulled the blankets from the crib to see the name Estella embroidered on it. He wrapped it around her. Estella, he murmured. That's a beautiful name. The baby giggled. Her tiny hands attempted to grab onto his fingers. He allowed her to do so, and she instantly chewed them. You're lucky you're cute. You can get away with using me as a chew toy. His thumb caressed her cheek, drawing little patterns on her skin with his thumb, just like his brother used to do with him. He walked with Estella to the window and looked over the city from a high distance. Only some streetlights were on, and those that were flickered at timed intervals. A separate apartment building was opposite them. One room was lit, and a cloaked figure stared at them. Tommy held Estella tighter to his chest, narrowing his eyes at the figure. A taunting smile reflected. It was Dream. The masked man pointed to the street. Tommy followed his direction and frowned at another figure running from the bottom floor of the other apartment building. The tall figure had a beanie on, with a gray streak of hair peeking through. Tommy looked back up to the lit room, but it was empty. Uncomfortable, he continued rubbing Estella's back and moved to close the curtains. Windows smashing and concrete crumbling beneath itself reached his ears, before a violent fire and an explosion blurred his vision. The apartment opposite him burst into flames from the bottom floor. Bricks cracked from its layering. A dust cloud immersed the street. Tommy froze, his voice locked in his throat. His ears rang, and Estella's high-pitched cries rattled the apartment. His grip on her tightened, and he ran towards the children's rooms. More explosions clattered the streets, and he rushed to wake the family up. Tears slipped down his face. The family lay silent. Everything Tommy did to wake them up didn't work. Estella shrieked as the floor beneath them rumbled. Another explosion sounded. The walls shook, and Tommy ran, with Estella clutched to his side, down the apartment stairs. His heart pounded, and his knees weakened as cracks splintered the staircase. Broken pieces of concrete flew at his body, cutting his skin. He tried to console the crying baby in his arms. For once, in all his lives, Tommy was scared to die. Fumes watered his eyes, and his flesh burned. Fire, blood, and dust engulfed them. The single cry of a baby bounced off the walls as he kissed the top of her head. The floor collapsed, taking them both with it. Someone kicked him awake. His lungs ached as fresh air encased them. He opened his irritated eyes to a dark room. Tommy clawed at his chest, but the lack of weight in his arms, the lack of Estella, instilled fear into his core. His breathing hastened, panic rendering him useless. "Estella?" he yelled. The stabbing in his throat didn't stop him from screaming out her name, hoping that this wasn't real, that she was safe in that fucking crib and none of this ever happened. Steps echoed through the dark room. He scrambled backwards. Whimpers left his quivering lips. Dream towered over him, his mask painted with blood. What was that? Dream, what the fuck was that? He stammered, his body tense and exploited. "You asked me questions in our last visit that I couldn't answer," Dream replied, his tone too casual for what Tommy had just witnessed. "This is me answering." "Where's Estella?" he demanded. "Where the fuck is she?" The sigh that left Dream only furthered the fear and doubt in Tommy. "Please, Dream, where is she?" he repeated, more desperate this time. The lack of response killed the growing hope in him. He didn't want the answer to be true. "Why did you?" Tommy's voice broke down into sobs. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to mimic the comfort Estella brought him. "Why did you show me that?" "That wasn't all," Dream said, and light in the room flickered. Two figures stood in the room. The man he saw earlier running away from the other apartment before it exploded, and another version of Dream. This Dream's mask wasn't stained with blood. The two were arguing as the man with the beanie drew tallies on the whiteboard in front of him. Tommy crept closer. The man's face illuminated against the light. It was his brother. He scrambled backwards to Dream, gripping onto his cloak as his head ached. A radio turned on beside them, announcing 2 explosions that went off in central North Dakota, detonating apartment complexes and taking a confirmed 270 lives. The tragedy was another act initiated by a terrorist named Willow's Siren. His stomach dropped as he realized the tallies his brother had written on the whiteboard matched the number of confirmed deaths from the explosions caused by Willow's Siren, caused by W. Soot, his big brother. Police sirens thundered from outside the dark room, and the other Dream began to shout. Yet the words didn't render in Tommy's ears as bile lodged in his throat. His brother grabbed a knife from the counter and plunged it deep into his heart. He fell backwards into the whiteboard and opened his mouth to speak. "Zagreus, son of Zeus and Persephone, god of hunting and rebirth. I am Medusa." Dream grasped onto Tommy's shoulder, and with tears in his eyes and screaming in his head, they appeared on top of the maze walls, in the void again. He didn't understand what was going on. He didn't understand why Dream was doing this to him. His brother was a fucking murderer? His brother killed that family, Tommy dropped to the floor. Sobs wrecked his throat. He hugged himself as he shook, tears drowning his misery. Dream kneeled in front of him and placed a hand on his back. The masked man whispered comforting words, just like Tommy did to Estella, until he could breathe again. What happened?" Tommy wept, gripping at his chest with guilt. "You asked me why I didn't tell you your brother was cursed, and that was why," Dream said, bitterly. Your brother took advantage of his immortality and caused destruction in every single life. He realized the potential he could achieve in a world where you never have to face the legal repercussions of your actions, when you could just restart by guessing incorrectly. Tommy's tears continued to fall, his heart faltering. All this time, he was grieving and remembering a man who slaughtered innocents for centuries, who thrived on chaos. He thought death would have healed his brother's broken soul, but it only fueled the madness. What did the other version of you say to him before he... He trailed off. His bottom lip trembled. I gave him an ultimatum. Either he disclosed his myth that he already knew was his, or I would drown him in the river Lethe and send him to Tartarus, breaking his curse of immortality. Dream explained, and Tommy's breath hitched. What option did he choose? He asked, frightened of the answer he would get. Dream remained silent. Where is my brother? He guessed incorrectly. The brother you knew is gone. More tears shed, and guilt wormed into his heart. He was mourning a murderer, a terrorist, his big brother. The man who hugged him close when the dark nights after the First War got too hard for Tommy to handle on his own, was imprisoned in the infernal abyss of torment and suffering, the deepest level of the underworld, Tartarus. Dream reached for his arm, and Tommy jerked backwards. He didn't want to be shown any more of this. He underestimated how small the maze walls were, and slipped, his back hurtling to the ground before Dream caught him by his hand. The breath left his lungs as they hung. The only thing keeping him from falling to his death was the hand of the god who dropped Theseus in his first life. Dream, please, just tell me, Tommy beseeched as he squeezed Dream's hands. Is my brother still alive? He is, though he's not your brother anymore. The river Lethe makes you forget who you are. Its water strips you of everything. Your identity, your memories, your appearance, everything. The grip between them wavered as Dream continued. But I did grow tired of watching your brother act like an amnesiac ghost crying in Tartarus, so I let him be reborn into another body, without the curse, without the memories of who he really is. Where is he? Tommy demanded, his legs kicking at the vines on the maze wall to secure his safety. That's the exciting part. He's still a brother to you. Dream's grip loosened as a cruel smile twisted on his lips. Say hello to Wilbur for me. And Tommy fell. He woke up, screaming. He thrashed violently against hands that held him down. His throat scratched itself raw until the view of his bedroom rendered for him. His entire world, his entire memory of his brother had shattered and rebuilt into something more terrifying and traumatizing right in front of him. Someone beside his bed grabbed his arms, holding them still as the adrenaline left his system and a frail mess remained behind. Techno, with his pink hair braided, sat by his side and consoled him as tears poured from his eyes and wails strained his chest. Another pair of arms touched him, and the brown eyes that once brought warmth to Tommy chilled his core. He screamed again, more hysteric than the last, as Wilbur reached to comfort him. He flinched backwards, his body shaking into Techno. This was his brother. Wilbur was his brother, whether he remembered himself or not. This was the man who blew up the nation he founded, massacred thousands until Tartarus detained him. Get away from me! Get away! Please, just go! Tommy begged, his voice breaking with every plea as he backed further into Techno. He shut his eyes and leaned into Techno's shoulder, wishing that this was still part of the void, that this was just part of Dream's tricks. Wilbur, I've got this. Go back to bed. Techno whispered as he put his arms around Tommy. He opened his eyes to see hurt flash across Wilbur's face as he left the room. But all Tommy could think of was the distress on Estella's face as the building crashed around them. It's okay, Tommy. Techno said, his voice low and tender. It was just a nightmare. Tommy shook his head into Techno's shoulder. No, it wasn't a nightmare. It's real. It's real, and I can't... Shh. Techno soothed, rubbing his back. Calm down. It's all right. He didn't know how long had passed until his breathing evened and his face dried. Techno tucked Tommy back into his bed. I'll stay here until you fall asleep, Techno said, as Tommy's eyes drooped with exhaustion. He didn't want to deal with this anymore. Can you? He stopped himself. No, don't worry. What do you need? Techno asked, earnestly. Can you keep talking? He said. He couldn't fall asleep to silence, or even alone, not after what he had seen. Now, if Wilbur was here, he'd sing you to sleep. But I'll do you one better. I'll recite the art of war for you to fall asleep to. Tommy tried to conceal his flinch at the mention of Wilbur. Thank you, he mumbled, resting his head against his pillow. His eyes shut, and consciousness slipped, with Techno's voice anchoring him to a peaceful rest. A rest that didn't haunt him with the knowledge that the man he was closest to in this family was the same person who had abandoned him in a world stained with war and blood, whether Wilbur was aware of it or not.